Believe it or not, it's the second day of December. It's a Tuesday morning, and we're broadcasting live here from the channel Fifth Connection. If you've reached us, then you understand that this channel is given to talking you through the storyline of the scriptures. And this morning we are in Ephesians chapter 5, and we are in verse number 25. Wives have often articulated their sense of when male preachers in particular are teaching through the relationship of the husband to the wife and vice versa, that the tendency is to come down a lot harder on the female species than the male. Well, I, for one, throughout ministry, have always felt that I need to go after the hard target first. The hard target is the male. Because somehow men feel their responsibility is so unique that they don't ever have to be addressed about it. And so I have seldom made a focus of ministry, the wife, in an overly emphatic kind of way, but rather gone after the husband because he's the head of the home. And in Ephesians chapter 5, Paul has been preparing us for this whole talk about the beauty of war, which comes up in chapter 6, verse number 10 to 24. But he prepares us for it by addressing the guardrails that form the basis of this beachhead, or for this beachhead called house and home. These relationships are guardrailed. In other words, God has set up rails, guardrails. He's put it in place to protect any kind of abuse or extremism that we can take our responsibility to. So our responsibility as wives and as husbands and bosses and children and parents, incidentally, all are covered. They are guardrailed by values. In chapter 1, verse number 1 to verse number 7, for example, the values that need to govern the field of relationality, the field where relationships exist. It's called household order. And it's inside of that household order that values are to be honored, biblical values. Choices are to be free, not manipulated, not hijacked. We need to become enlightened. We need to wake up to what God is doing in our lives and in the believing community, as well as in our world. And we need to become skilled at living life. That's what wisdom is all about. And so these four walks that the writer talks about in 4, 5, and 6, walk worthy with high values in mind. Walk in love. Afford others the freedom of choice. Husbands, including your wives. Let them choose. That's obviously after dialogue. I think often you'd hear wives say, but you didn't consult me. And now you're sitting in a difficult situation. There's mutuality there because it's values that guardrail our relationships. It's the freedom of choice, affording others the willingness or the capacity to choose. And then waking up to what is really real, waking up in our lives to what God is doing, to walk in light. That's what it means to be enlightened. And then to walk in wisdom, which has to do with skillful navigation of all our relationships. Oh, how we need that, how we need to grow at that. We can never say we've got it all. We cannot do that. There's always something to learn, and places where we need to consult and be consultative as others talk to us and consult with us. Verse number 25 says, husbands, love your wives. Now, that's a whole talk on its own already, but you cannot extract it out of the storyline, because now he's going to talk again about the affordance of choice. Husbands, allow your wives interactively to freely choose. As we interact with them, we give them the freedom to choose. Now, there is an ultimate sense in which the husband is responsible for what happens under his roof. He cannot run away. He cannot absent himself from that equation. Because when the men walk away, it makes it a lot harder for the women to be. And as a friend of mine, a young teaching colleague said, well, the single mom can't be husband and wife. They want to be husband and wife to the child and father and mommy to the child all at the same time. And there is a sense in which you can't, because the scriptures presents dual parenting as the option. In situations where there's been divorce, where there's been abusive situations and there's separation, then the believing community needs to step up. And that's why if the church is not enabling and equipping its families, the families will not enrich the church, so that the church is then able to step up. But if she's not equipping, how can she expect enrichment from the family? And so the questions that I gave in a previous episode to wives are the same questions that would suffice for the husband. And we'll go through that in a moment. It says, husbands, love your wives according to this standard. And it sounds, because it is an impossible standard, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Because we have a weakness, we become egoically attached as husbands to our own self-importance, and we cannot wrench ourselves away from that except God enable us. The standard is, love your wives as Christ loved the church. He afforded a choice. That's why believers and assemblies have the freedom to choose. And the desire on the part of God is always that they choose what is good, true, and beautiful, what is right, just, and fair. And Christ gave himself up for the church. That's how the husband is to sacrifice himself up for his wife. Husbands, give affordance of choice to your wives as the appointed one loves the assembly. That is Christ. He's the appointed one. And he loves the assembly. He loved her to the point of death. Yes, husbands, that's the standard. I love her to the point of dying. Giving up myself, dying to my own ambitions, living for her and to give her the best optionality to be what God has called her to be. Christ gave himself up for her. And so, husbands, the questions are very much the same, because we live in a day of pacifiers and what I would call vigilante moms, because moms are almost walking that road alone. If over 50%, I think over 54% of children in this country are growing up without daddy, can you imagine the pressure it puts on mommy? And you wonder why mommies function almost as vigilantes. Now, I've been in the teaching profession long enough to see all the shades of gray on this one. And single moms are fighters, because in a sense, that's the only thing they know, to fight for their families, irrespective of respect, of love, and honor, because they find themselves in such precarious situations. And they take very often the law into their own hands because they fight like daddies fight, because daddies have run away. Passive fathers, vigilante mothers. And of course, the impact of that on the boys is very interesting. Studies show some very, very significant ways how a passive father impacts his children, and a vigilante, dominant mom impacts her boys and the girls in turn. Husbands, give affordance of choice to your wives as the appointed ones, as the appointed one, that is Christ, loves the assembly and sacrificed himself for her. And here I want to just show you again the importance of the questions that we looked at when we looked at the role of the wife in a marital relationship. When you hear your responsibility as a husband being love your wife, as we say, love them to death, but literally loving them is giving up yourself for their well-being. You see, sometimes this word love for the husband becomes a cuss word because they don't know how. They were charmers before they got married, and now they're not charming their wives anymore. They're charming other people's, other husbands' wives, and not charming their own wife. So, husband, when you hear this responsibility, love your wife, what do you feel when you hear that? I think some males don't have a cooking clue. They can scarcely spell the word. And they associate love with this icky, kind of wishful, fantasy feeling. And love is affordance of choice. It has to do with choosing and at times making the hard decisions. Why do you feel this way when you hear your responsibility is to love your wife and you figure you're doing a poor job? When did you start feeling this way? Where did this feeling of inadequacy in the sphere of loving your wife, where did it come from? And what need in your life was or is not met as you grew up as a child, as a teen, as a young adult, that has spoken into or spoken death into your life because you don't have a cooking clue of how to love your wife? A couple of thoughts came to my mind this morning, which is really tough to share, because we have a hard time articulating what discipleship looks like inside of a marriage. My wife is a product of my discipling as a hubby, as a husband, with all my imperfections. And you see, imaging Jesus in his death and resurrection, can I repeat that? Imaging Jesus in his death and resurrection is what discipleship in marriage is all about. Are you feeding your wife spiritually from the scriptures, emotionally ministering to her needs, watching for when inclement weather blows in, watching for what causes the mood swing, and posturing to serve? Imaging Jesus in his death and resurrection is what discipling in marriage is all about. These are wonderful fodder for discussion and interaction, because we hear so little talk about death and resurrection inside of marriage as the pattern. And becoming established in the gospel, yes, becoming established in this thing called gospel is about being strengthened in the pattern of death and resurrection. Husband, dying to your own aspirations, leaving that wonderful idea that you have to buy a bigger home, to go for a bigger car, to chase a bigger salary at the expense of the health of your marriage. Growing older and not being on the lookout for what is happening along the way. You see, it's about dying to live. It's about experiencing His death in my life to my selfish ambition and rising with new fervor, new verve, new nerve. Because you see, taking up your cross as a husband is about, listen to this, picking up the responsibility to make her life better. Now, a lot of Christians don't like that word. To making her life better in every way you can. Now you say, well, I can't afford it. Well, it is amazing how little you can get by without, and get by with. If you would but apply your mind, take up your responsibility to make her life better and failing at it. Yes, you heard me. Husbands, failing at it through betrayal and injustice. Because, yeah, right inside of our marriages, we suffer under that because we are all simultaneously sinners and sanctified. Now, you can't forget that. But you can't major on that. But you will understand that at times we are treacherous toward each other. And we are unjust with the way we deal with one another inside of our marriages. I want to suggest to you that failing through it by taking the hit. You as a husband, you're going to take the hit. What's the hit? The egoic severance that you have tied between you and that thing, or you and that person, another person, and losing focus of where your wife is postured. You will fail many times across your life in your marriage, more times than you will be willing to admit. And I say that very carefully. Because as husbands, we need to understand that we are feet of clay as well. And you're going to fail many times, but take the hit. What's the hit all about? What's the egoic severance all about? The hit of dying into your marital life moment by moment. Learning to die into life, into your marital life. Is the pattern for the family, the pattern for your life as a man, for your life as a woman, for the lives of the kids, for the life of the believing community, the assembly, the Church of Jesus Christ, is dying in order to rise. But when it comes close, the way I've articulated it this morning, husbands, pick up the responsibility to make her life better in every way you can. And yet failing through it, through betrayal and injustice, by taking the hit, the egoic severance, the hit that God uses, and that hit is death. The hit of dying into your marital life moment by moment by moment. You can't say this is boring. It makes life so dynamic, and we have our moments of dullness where the clouds roll in. But this morning, the takeaway is absolutely huge. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. He loved the church. And how did he do that? By dying into that responsibility. Gave up his life. Maybe 50 years ago, you said, I'd be willing to die for you, my love. But 50 years later, you're saying, I wish you'd die. Now, what moved? What shifted? Imaging Jesus in your marriage has to do with death and resurrection. That's what discipleship inside of a marriage looks like. Wish I had the time to extrapolate a lot more on this, because this is so crushing and yet so challenging, and yet in every way possible, because of who God is and because of whose I am. I trust this morning, husbands, as you go into your life, your work life, your marital life, your parenting life. Go into it with a consciousness that I am not here just for my own benefit. I'm here for the benefit of others. God has created us in a very unique way. He's created us by making us, right? He's the creator. We are his people. He has created us. And as a result, God does not only make the world, but he makes it make itself. And in my marriage, he's made us. He makes creatures make each other. As I said to you, my wife is a product of my discipling. And my weaknesses show up in her life. It is very humbling, but you're going to become conscious of that today as you grapple with this truth. And so as we continue to walk with God, I trust that you would enjoy him and enjoy the wife of your youth. May God bless you this day as you go with him. Goodbye for now.